And a special thank you to Luceli and Sabrina. This project started as a collaborative project with two Denison students. And thank you to DERF for funding our research trip to Mexico City to collect the data. And then Sabrina and I went to a training, the Digital Humanities Summer Institute at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. So a lot of this work is collaborative with these two students. So I'll go ahead and get started. So I want to start with a wedding application for two enslaved peoples from Mexico City in the 1630s. And the first question that you might ask is, wait, enslaved peoples could marry? Well, they could in colonial Latin America, in Spanish and Portuguese, and in French America. As Catholics, they had access to all of the sacraments, save becoming priests or nuns. They were excluded from that. But baptism, marriage, confirmation, last rites were all available to enslaved peoples. In my book that Hosna mentioned, I used materials like this to try to get at questions of slave identity and slave community. Basically, I'll show you here in a second, but what this is an application from Domingo Moreno, way down deep inside. He says he wants to marry another enslaved person whose name is Maria de la Cruz. And then the second page, which I'm not showing, will include two witnesses, testigos, who come forward and testify that the bride and the groom, are not unencumbered to marry, that they're not already married, that they're not related, that they haven't taken religious vows that would prevent them from marrying. But within that is some information that historians use to try to get us at slave identity and slave community. So, just to sort of drive that point home, basically it's just a bunch of counting. Because the individual members would say something about their ethnicity or their race, and then we would cross-tabulate who people are marrying. And that's about all we could do. But this is a close-up of that application, and there's three sort of parts here that I want to pull out that really inform the project that I'm engaged in right now. So the first one is the bride. Her name is Maria de la Cruz. She's a Creole, which means that she was born in Mexico. She was actually born in the Yucatan. She's enslaved to a lawyer who works for the royal government. And it says that he is a resident next to the convent of St. Catherine of Siena. When I was in Mexico decades ago, collecting this data the first time, I read that and I was like, wow, that's really interesting, but I don't know what to do with it. I have no idea. The second piece of information here is Pedro Garcia, who is one of the two witnesses. He's from Angola, and it says that he's a resident of the Barrio de Santo Domingo, which is near the convent of San Diego. Now, for the longest time, I had no idea how one might be able to use that data because it felt very, very unspecific. Totally by accident, I was working on a book prize, and I was reading a book, and I was looking at a map of Mexico City, a street map, and I was like, wait a second. The colonial names of streets in Mexico City do not operate in the way that we think of names working. So it's not Broad Street or Main Street. Each individual street is often named for a religious institution that's on that street. So it turns out that the convent of Santa Catalina de Sena is, I can identify where that is on a map, and the street that sits in front of that is called the street of Santa Catalina de Sena. Same thing for Santo Domingo. I'll show you that in just a second. The third reason that I started with this piece, Domingo Moreno. Domingo is important, but what's really important here is the person who enslaved him, his master or owner. His name is Juan Gómez de Trasmante, and his job there is master builder on the main cathedral. In the 1630s, the cathedral is being rebuilt, and he was the master builder. But Gómez de Trasmante is famous, most famous, as a map maker of colonial Mexico. So these are two maps that he created in 1628. of the city of Mexico City. I apologize that they aren't rendering a little bit better, but this is the best resolution that I could get. One of the things that's weird about these maps is that this is north. Left is north, right is south. So the city is on an angle, but this map right here on our right is one that we think is a good representation of what the city looked like in the 1620s and 1630s. It's hard to see here, but on some of the, there's a few green spaces, and I can show you a larger version of it. Some of these green spaces are some of these religious institutions. So I'm able to identify where these two particular places are on this map. But I wanted to do more. So it turns out that we can't do more until we get into the 1750s. These are two maps that represent the northwestern and southwestern quadrants of the city. The northeastern quadrant, the map is not nearly as lovely as this, and the other quadrant, the southeast, does not exist. We don't know where it is. But this was taken in the context of a census from the 1750s. And each of these letters that you can see here represents a name that's listed down here in the index. So basically, this is one way that I can start to identify individual streets in Mexico City. But still hard because that's not an actual physical representation of the city. So the first scientific map of Mexico City is created in the 1780s, in 1785. And this is a map of Mexico City. Now north is north. The middle there is the Zócalo, or the main heart of Mexico City. On the north of the Zócalo is the cathedral, where these enslaved peoples would get married. And on every border is major municipal buildings, state, royal government, so on and so forth. On this map, I'm not sure that you can see this, but if you go directly north up here, that's Santo Domingo. That's the convent that Pedro Garcia said he lived by. So we're starting to get somewhere. And just to show you, I'm switching over, hopefully, to Google Earth. This is Google Earth of Mexico City. You can see the Zócalo right there in the middle. This would be the main cathedral. Up here is Santo Domingo. And then over here, you can't really see it unless I scroll in, which is always backwards, is St. Catherine. And I'm going to skip that. But basically, that map maps directly onto Mexico City today. So what that allows me to do is to georeference, or what it allowed Sabrina to do, she's the one who did this, is to georeference a map directly on top of a Google map. So the top image here is a map, a copy of that 1785 map that was created in 1795. The reason that we used it is that the image that we have is a little bit better. The map is in a little bit better shape, and so it's flat. And it also has the street names on the street, so that I don't have to go, that's San Francisco, and then create that. But what Sabrina did is she sat down over a summer, and she created a Google Street Map of Mexico City in the 1630s. Using that, I can then find GPS coordinates for individual addresses and use those to start plotting where enslaved peoples lived. So I've gotten way far ahead of myself, and I should back up a little bit. The question is why? Why do this? Well, the fun thing for me when I started is I didn't know the answer to the question. Like, I didn't know what I was going to see when I was able to go through this data and project it. I just had some questions. So I went to Donnie and Trent, I should thank them as well, and said, I have questions. And we had lots of conversations about how I might answer those questions. And it's been a long process of learning and dipping my toes into technology and the digital tools that I really don't know much about, but I can play with just enough to make semi-pretty pictures. So, what can we do with this material? Well, the first thing is, as I was thinking about the data that I have a marriage. It has 4 people in it. Sometimes it has as many as 8 people in it. A bride, a groom, witnesses. It gives their addresses. So I was able to take those addresses and plot on a map where enslaved peoples lived in Mexico City. This might seem unimportant, but I can say I've been working on this topic for a couple of decades now, and I've never really thought about where enslaved peoples lived in the city. I just assumed that they were in Mexico City, and Mexico City was a place, and it was a... But now I can figure out where it is that they live in the city relative to where their masters live. One of the interesting sort of phenomenons here is that in the lower right-hand corner, there's not many enslaved peoples, in large part because in 1629, the city flooded and that section of the city was underwater. So I'm not sure that anybody was actually living there in the 1620s and 1630s. But we can see that enslaved peoples are all over the place. Okay, great, they're all over the place. But what I really wanted to know was the relationship, to be able to draw lines between individual enslaved people. So this is my attempt to do that. Using another technology. The map was created in ArcGIS, and then I found another program called Gephi, which is a social networking tool that allows you to draw lines between members of a social network. And so what all of these colored lines represent are not necessarily connections between people, but connections between places. So the size of the circle says something about the number of individuals that I have in my data set who lived in that place, and then the lines coming out are where they were connected with individual enslaved peoples across the city. It's very bright, I apologize for that, but that was Gephi. Again, dipped my toes in, I'm not a master yet. But I want to back up for a second. I can sort of stay here. Oops, not there yet. So, I said a lot about maps, and I said a lot about my initial project, but I think as I was envisioning my project, it's important to talk about context. Historians want to know what was happening in a particular time in a particular place. And so it's important to know what was going on in Mexico for enslaved peoples so that I can interpret some of this data. So the first thing is that the surprise to many, New Spain, modern-day Mexico, was the second largest importer of slaves in the Americas before 1650. Only Brazil imported more enslaved peoples. And to give you a sense, the first enslaved African arrived in British North America in 1619, so slavery was just barely getting started in Virginia. But it had been in Mexico for almost a century at that point. And it turns out that the period that I'm interested in, the 1620s and 1630s, and in this particular instance, is a really important transition phase for enslavement in Mexico because the slave trade largely ends to Mexico. Spain and Portugal, who had been united until the 1640s, made a decision about where they were going to send the enslaved peoples that they were recruiting from Africa. And they decided to send them to South America and stop importing enslaved peoples to Mexico. So Mexico City, as a result of this importation of slaves, might well be the largest urban population of enslaved peoples in the Americas in the 1630s. The only place that would be similar in size might be Cartagena and Salvador in Brazil. We have no idea how many enslaved peoples lived in Mexico City. Estimates are 5,000, 10,000. I think 10,000 is a little high. But urban Mexico City is one of the first instances where we see an enslaved urban population from Africa. The other thing that's important, beyond the reliance on the slave trade and the reality that most of the people that I'm talking about are actually African, or African-born, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. The data that I have comes from basically 1629 to 1637. It's not because I think that those years are really important, it's because those are the years that I have data. got 413 marriages in that time span, and I'm missing, I did the math last night, 42 of 108 months of data. So I have a very, very incomplete data set, but in terms of comparisons in my book, I look at 1640 to the 1760s. I don't have 400 marriages to base my material on. So there's a real concentration of marriage applications here, which is exciting for me because it allows me to start thinking about the possibility of people appearing multiple times in multiple marriage applications. And that's actually the reason that Pedro Garcia was up at the very beginning, because he shows up in 19 different weddings as a wedding witness. The other thing that's happening in Mexico City is right about this time, we're pretty comfortable as historians arguing that the Spanish had sort of developed a clear anti-black racist perspective. There was a series of rebellions, one in 1608, 1609, and another one in 1611 that sort of shook the colony. So in 1612, there's a trial of enslaved conspirators. We're not really sure that there was actually a rebellion, but they were accused of rebellion, and 35 enslaved Africans were put to death right there in that empty space in the middle of the map. They were hung. 8 of them were drawn and quartered. Body parts were placed around the city to signal to everybody, but particularly to black people, don't get out of line. In the wake of those rebellions, there was a series of laws that were passed seeking to restrict the movement and power of enslaved people. So they weren't allowed to ride horses, they couldn't be armed, women were not allowed to wear pretty dresses or jewelry. And then the one that I think is most significant is the law was passed that said enslaved peoples are not allowed to congregate in groups larger than 4. So there was a real attempt to try to sort of pull these people apart. Circling back to that idea about the surprise that there's marriage at all, as we think about enslavement, as we think about the experiences of Africans in the Americas, a very powerful theory that's a great way to sort of enter into our conversations of enslavement comes from a sociologist whose name is Orlando Patterson. And he writes a book called Slavery as Social Death. And his argument there is that enslavement is the most socially alienating position that a human being can experience. There's no other position in human society that's more detached from family, from community, from place. And so what we have are people from Angola who probably came as teenagers, who were dumped into a new context, moving around the city. And we've thought for a long time that they were largely individuals, that they sort of suffered individually. One of the things that we use these marriage applications to do is to push back against that just a little bit, to argue that in fact they were constructing communities in the Americas. Okay. So one of the things that's really interesting about this material is that I have 2 examples. One is Pedro Garcia, and another is a guy named Francisco, who works in a hospital, of all places, who sponsor lots of couples as they seek to get married. They serve as wedding witnesses. And basically, as I said before, the wedding witnesses promise that the 2 people are free to marry and that they've been in the colony long enough to actually earn the right. Enslaved peoples had to be in Mexico for 6 years before they could marry. So Francisco and Pedro Garcia are telling a priest, yes, Domingo and Maria are free to marry, and you should go ahead and let them do that. And they can get in trouble if they lie. If they perjure themselves, they get in trouble with the church. So what I have here are 2 people, Francisco and Pedro Garcia, and the thing that I find most surprising about this image is how far apart they lived from the people that they interacted with, from the people that they sponsored. Sometimes 4 kilometers. What does that suggest? Not really sure yet. But I think what it suggests is a lot of physical mobility. I think it suggests that enslaved peoples are moving through the city and interacting with each other. You can see that the centerpiece is still sort of the cathedral there. Francisco's community is really surprising because he lives in the northwest corner of the city, and many of the people that he sponsors are actually on the other side of the city. They're in the eastern zones. For Pedro Garcia, it seems to be much more sort of centered in the center of the city. So maybe he had a little bit smaller social universe than did Francisco. I think, I have no way to prove this, but I think that Francisco probably encountered these people because he worked in the infirmary. There's a little bit of data that shows up every once in a while where someone will say, this is my job. So some women, particularly, who appear as sponsors, work in a major market that's there in the plaza, in front of the cathedral, as vendors. They sell chickens, or they sell fruit, or they sell vegetables, or whatever. But in this case, we know that Francisco works in an infirmary of a hospital. And I wonder, and I have no way of knowing the answer to this, if he doesn't encounter people who are coming to the hospital as a way to sort of interact with these enslaved peoples from across the city. So, as I said, still incomplete, but if we look at the data that I said 413 weddings. I have about 1,500 individuals, and I can draw the relationships between all of them if I have an address for them. And I have addresses for about 7 in 10 people. I can get that number up probably to 90%, 9 in 10, if I cross-reference. Because, for example, Pedro Garcia, half the time he doesn't give an address. But I know it's him because of his name, his enslaver's name, his ethnicity, and then they give an age as well. So I'm pretty comfortable that the 19 guys, the 19 Pedro Garcias who show up are the same guy. There's one other Pedro Garcia who lived in a different place, and it totally threw me for a long time. I was like, oh yeah, it's a different guy. No big deal. But I was still interested in the 10% that I can't draw because I don't have addresses for. And I was walking the dog one day, and I was like, wait a second. There's so much more that I can do with the technology that I'm already using. So this is really hard to see. This is a social network analysis of the entire data set. I'm sorry that you can't see, but these little green lines are the connections between individuals. So on the outside, you'll see lots of sort of conglomerations that are a single marriage. But something's happening in the middle where we're seeing lots and lots of connections. Oops, wrong one. Still wrong one. The longest sort of social network that I found includes 320 people, which to my mind is really exceptional. To find a social network of enslaved peoples in Mexico City in the 1630s that includes over 300 people with a data set that probably is about 60% of the marriages that were performed is really, really amazing. And it suggests to me a very powerful community that's being formed there. It's hard to see, and I apologize for that, but if we look up at the top with Pedro Garcia and Francisco, we can see that there's actually connections, multiple connections that sort of link them together. So it's not just Pedro Garcia and the 19 brides and grooms that he supports, but somehow he's connected to Francisco and another Francisco through multiple people. We might think, oh wow, Pedro Garcia and Francisco are the most important. But it turns out that this couple right here, a Pedro and a Monica, are the most important because they're actually the linchpin between two large conglomerations of people. So I never would have found that without Gepi. Like I could count Pedro Garcia 19 times and I could say, oh yeah, he represented or he was a witness in a whole bunch of marriages and here's the people that he spoke to or spoke for. But I never would have been able to realize that But he may not be the most important person in the network because he's not the thing that holds multiple connections together. So, a couple of other things that I just want to sort of point out. Because this is so new to me, and I'm working through it as I go, there's lots of questions that I have that I want to ask and try to answer that I hope that I might be able to. So just to give an example of that, it's the same social network, but rather than just looking at the color here represents basically the weight, the number of connections that any node or individual would have. In this case, I used information on race and ethnicity. So the change here is that the red represents Angolans, people who come from the Portuguese colony of Angola. The green represents Congolese enslaved peoples who come from the Kingdom of Congo. And then the bluish purple are actually people like Maria de la Cruz, who were born in the Americas. They were Creoles or Creoles. So I can do this for the entire data set to look at how race or ethnicity shapes these social networks that I'm encountering. I'm hoping to do it with master occupation. So in the original wedding application, it said that Domingo's owner was one Gomez de Trasmante, and that he was a master builder, so he's a craftsperson. For almost every other master, there's some sort of occupation that's listed. The hard part is sort of creating categories that make sense. Churchmen, craftsmen, bureaucrats, so on. The other thing that makes it really hard is that about 35 to 40% of the enslaved people who appear in these records were owned by widows, which is a whole other topic for conversation, and I'd be happy to answer questions on that, but they don't list an occupation. So all I know is that they were owned by a woman who had been married, whose husband had died. There is information sometimes about the husband and his occupation. Whether or not I want to go down that road, I'm not really sure yet, because that's actually getting pretty far away from the thing that I'm most interested in, which is the enslaved people. But it might well be that craftspeople interacted with each other, and their enslaved peoples interacted with each other, and that's how these communities came together. I don't honestly know yet, but it seems like there's lots and lots and lots of possibilities. So I'll end by saying I sort of sold my talk by saying, I'm using all these technologies. ArcGIS created the maps. Gephi allowed me to create these social networks, these visualizations of the social networks. I'm using R to manipulate the data sets, to play with my databases, and then I did that same training in Victoria for a Python workshop, and I used Python script to read my database and create a second database that I'm using to generate these connections. So, totally out of my depth. But it's fun, because I get to make pictures like this. I mean, my book has no pictures in it. So, where does that leave us? Still with lots of unanswered questions, but I think the promise here, the ability to visualize this, to put enslaved peoples on a map, to demonstrate who it is that they interacted with across the cityscape, to be able to visualize the social network in new ways that's not just sort of abstract in our head, but is actually physical, and to be able to play with this so that it represents something new is an interesting way to sort of think about the experiences, or way to think through the experiences of enslaved peoples in Mexico City. So I think that's it. Thank you.